Welcome to the fourth in this season's Cambridge Climate Lecture Series. The lecture series was set up 4 years ago in memory of David Mackay, one of Cambridge's great scientists, physicists, engineers. If you haven't seen his book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, then you really ought to look it up. It's available online. It's a wonderful example of how important it is to do sums. David Mackay was once asked why he was so much in favour of nuclear power, and he said, well, I'm not pro-nuclear power, I'm just pro-arithmetic, which is David Mackay through and through. It's been wonderful over the years having fantastic speakers coming in to talk to us on the subject of climate change and related subjects. And we've been live streaming every one of our talks. You can go online and have a look at the recordings from all of our previous talks. Tonight is no exception, is live streamed. Those of you who want to contribute to the discussion afterwards, please use the hashtag #CCLS2020 and we'll endeavour to inject your questions into the conversation afterwards. So now Jeremy Leggett is a fantastic communicator on the subject of energy. In particular, he's set up a company, Solar Century, and he's going to hopefully give us a bit of optimism about things that we have been doing and can be doing, but perhaps tell us a few truths about the situation we're in with regard to climate change. So I'd like to invite Jeremy Leggett to talk to us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for coming here tonight. I've been a climate campaigner now for 3 decades for my sins, all the way through the drama that began in the late 1980s, before the climate negotiations started in 1990. And from 1990 through to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, I was a constant attendee of the governmental negotiations. And most of you, maybe all of you, will know that in 1997 the first treaty was produced. It was called the Kyoto Protocol. It had no teeth really, but it was a sort of step forward, achieved against expectation. And I described that in the first book. This is not a book sale, by the way. This is just to show, my involvement historically in this business. And then the second major treaty was, of course, the Paris Agreement of December 2015. And that I followed very closely, and again went to many of the sessions and wrote another book. As you can tell by now, I love to scribble. And that one I called The Winning of the Carbon War. Not how we won the carbon war, but the winning of. Because at that time, at the Paris Climate Summit, on the last night of that climate summit, when they agreed the treaty, which did have some teeth, kind of weak ones, but they were and they are teeth. At that point, I thought we were on a winning trajectory, finally. Then there was 2016, and after that, 2017 and 2018, and I no longer hold that view. I'm still a climate campaigner, but all this experience, including, in my own case, a scientific background. Before 1989, I was a scientist, an earth scientist. I was on the faculty at Imperial College at the Royal School of Mines, and I studied earth history there, stratigraphy, for those of you who might be earth scientists. And that's what got me worried about climate change before it was kind of fashionable. And so I sort of bring that scientific background, but it's sort of very much I no longer view myself as a scientist, I view myself as a campaigner. And I'm a business person only because of the climate campaigning. I'm masquerading as a business person, really, is the truth. And all of that I try and describe in these books. And I have to say, and there will be people here who agree with this and people who won't. So I'll sort of move quickly on to beyond the premise. The premise is that those of us who've been working on climate this long we're not expecting to see scenes like this in our lifetimes. This is apocalyptic stuff, and it's happening, or it happened earlier this year. You've all seen these pictures, and you know the story of the Australian wildfires, and that's just one of the impacts. And this talk is not going to be about this depressing stuff. It's going to, as our host said, hopefully be a bit, inject a bit of hope. It's a search for hope. And, it's a search with an edge of, certainly an edge of urgency and probably an edge of desperation. My great friend Jonathan Porritt is calling his forthcoming book, I will do an advert for his book, not mine, Hope in Hell. And that's a great title. That's the situation we're in my view. That's the premise for this talk. There'll be other people here who disagree, probably, certainly online, people who disagree. But I think, that you look at that image and that young woman, that girl, looking at that scene and contemplating her future, this is what climate campaigning is about now. It's about trying to find hope in this situation, which I think you can justifiably describe as at least a whiff of hell, if not the beginnings of the actuality. On top of that, other reasons to be depressed since 2016, and perhaps think that it'll be very difficult to keep this international rules-based order that gave us the Paris Agreement going beyond the time we're living in at the moment. Any number of these kinds of plots of geopolitics in the world. This is from the Economist Intelligence Unit. Democracy's in a pretty poor state, and even where we have democracies who are scoring relatively well on this matrix that they come up with, we collectively are electing leaders who are prepared to wave lumps of coal in parliaments and say this is the future, knowing everything we know. We're prepared to elect leaders who are proud to say that they dig coal in the democracies, never mind about the autocracies, which increasingly the fossil fuel incumbency is sheltering behind and are going to have to shelter behind, in my view, to keep doing what they want to do. So the approach I want to take tonight is not an academic one, it's a personal one. And I want to give a talk that is basically an appeal to crowdsource wisdom. And the premise you've heard, but the question, accepting the premise, is, where do you go with a hope in hell? What's the best thing to do if you're a climate campaigner? And this is my personal view. Other people will have different views. It's not that, the only route you can take, but it's a personal view I'm trying to convey to you tonight. What would a person, or should a person like me do with their lives, given that I'm not about to give up, I'm a fighter. I don't have as much hope in my heart as I used to, but I'm not going to give up. This is Dunkirk, and I'm going to be defending that beach until the very last. So what to do? And my personal choice is direct action in the market. Because here I think, where the money flows, there is the whiff of a survival instinct in our collective endeavors. And this image here shows a bunch of Norwegians. And the lady in the center is a conservative. She's the finance minister, Siv Jensen, and earlier in 2019 she had announced that the Norwegian state pension fund, the so-called oil fund, because it is entirely created from oil and gas revenues, would no longer be investing in pure play oil and gas companies. If you didn't know that, that is the situation in Norway, and that's coming through pressure from Norwegian kids on their parents. So they built up a $1 trillion sovereign wealth fund, biggest sovereign wealth fund in the world. It's no longer investing now in pure play oil and gas companies. There's wriggle room for the big folk, the BPs and the Shells, because they're not just doing oil and gas, are they? They're not really pure oil and gas companies. They're also doing renewables. Yes, 0.7% of their capital expenditure as an industry average. But anyway, that's what they've done, and it's the beginning of a process. Very clearly, it won't be too long before they're no longer investing in the very companies that have created the sovereign wealth fund. And you can see the drama in the faces here. That's what's going on. This is about the future of Norway. And there's a lot more oil and gas out there still in the Norwegian sector of the North Sea and to the north. And they also announced that henceforth they will invest in unlisted renewables companies, those not quoted on stock exchanges. And there's a ton of other stuff like this that you can see on my website. That is not what the talk's about tonight, but it's to give you a flavor of why, personally, my choice is to have a bash at creating vehicles that can attract this kind of capital that is beginning to be mobilized by what I hope is the survival instinct that we have collectively that's being expressed in the capital markets. So with that premise and choice in mind, please allow me to sort of construct the lecture around how to do this. What's the best route? And I'm going to present an idea that we can talk about in the discussion and hang some other discussion about the climate emergency on. Just a few thoughts for perhaps those of you who aren't familiar with the basic premises of climate change. What was agreed in Paris was a target to keep the global average temperature below 2 degrees Celsius, certainly, and 1.5 if possible. Now, it was a voluntary basis that governments signed up to this. They're pledges and targets. There weren't universal pledges and there weren't universal targets set. It was up to individual governments what they were prepared to pledge. And you summed all those pledges as of June 2019, and what you got was 3 degrees. And if you're new to the subject, keep this in mind, because I'm going to show you the thermometers in a minute, and it's a bit depressing if you don't know it, but anyway. And the current policies were a bit above that even, 3.3 degrees. So keep those figures in mind, have a look at that, and this is just one of the charts from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that came out last year. And you see straight away what the problem is. You look at the temperature rise that's going up on the left-hand side, and you see the risk that the scientists are prepared to ascribe collectively to different sectors of what's going on land. There's another one of these for the marine environment, there's another one for the cryosphere or the ice environments, and you see the problem. We're already in moderate risk territory. In some areas we're already in high risk, like wildfire damage, no surprise there. And purple is very high risk, and we kick into the purple above 2 degrees. And this is why governments really want to try and keep below 1.5 degrees if possible. That's why that was negotiated into the Paris Agreement against expectations. But you can see why, because this is the scientific advice they're getting from places like the Met Office and NASA and all the big agencies. So that's the only one I'm going to show. If you don't know these reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, the executive summaries are essential reading. The other problem, and this is the last slide about the science, is that the climate models that all this is based on are showing worrying trends. It looks as though the scientists have been systemically underestimating the risk. So you've got a number of models from around the world. You've got a 27 model average in the middle there. And what they're showing is the temperature, the average temperature, on a doubling of carbon dioxide. And 1.5 degrees is shown, and you know, the models are telling us we're heading for a horror show if we keep going. So we know exactly what the problem is. We know what's fueling the danger. This is the rise of fossil fuel burning in my lifetime, and the land use change, which has been flat, but you know, too much emission from land use changes. And then you see the state of the sinks in the oceans. They've been working hard, soaking up as much carbon dioxide as they can, but that's under threat because of things like acidification. The land, the sink is sort of expanding, but also under threat, obviously, with stuff like wildfire and droughts around. And the atmosphere, well, that's the repository for the heat-trapping gas, which is driving the problem. So we know what is wrong. We know what we have to do. And we know exactly what the solution is. We've got to get zero carbon. And a common target for doing that, the date to do it by is 2050. That's the UK's target, bound into law in our climate law. One of Mrs. May's final acts was to get that through. It's too late, I think. For most scientists, they'd say you're well above 2 degrees if you're on that trajectory. Extinction Rebellion wanted it to be before 2030. That's less than 10 years from now. The science-based targets, many of them, I think, I'm generalizing here, and if there are climate modelers in the audience, give me a bit of slack here. 2030 might be a good trajectory to stay below 1.5 degrees. It's 10 years from now, and if you think that's impossible, how does the world decarbonize in 10 years? I've got, and you asked me to give you one piece of evidence to read. It's the Zero Carbon Britain report by the Centre for Alternative Technology. There are others, but if you think that's impossible, I invite you to sort of think again. This is not what the talk's about. I could, go on for hours about this, but zero carbon can be achieved in principle very quickly if we didn't have all these barriers in geopolitics and everything else. That's the route to hope. That is how we give that young lady in that picture looking at that barbecued kangaroo hope for the future of her life. And this is the premise on which I'm going to base the rest of the talk, because I think there are 3 vital tasks that leap out at us if we accept this sum of premises so far in the talk. We've got to decarbonize economies. We've got to recarbonize land use, the brown stuff at the bottom there, and we've got to pressure those who persist with carbon emissions. I mean, not just talk to them nicely and have rational debates with them. We've got to put serious, painful pressure on them, and that's how you get change in society, I believe. And this is why Extinction Rebellion and striking school children had such an impact, where, old campaigners like me have been bashing our heads against a brick wall for decades, only to see this sort of breakthrough in understanding coming from the anguished youth as they begin to understand what we, my generation, have done to their future. So, what would someone like me want to do with the next 5 years? Here's my approach, and please forgive me if this sounds dangerously egomaniacal. It probably is egomaniacal, but we live in a time of consequences, and we have to think big. Some of us have to, stick our necks out and think big. So this is the big idea that I'm going to present to you tonight. And it'll be to create a vehicle which is a home for hope. It's a place where you can attack all these 3 tasks at the same time, score, if you're a cricketer, enormous runs very quickly for the climate under that one roof. It's a company, it's an intervention, a direct action in the capital markets. It will attract, if it's successful, a great many worried people to invest in it. And why wouldn't we call it what it needs to be part of? Zero carbon revolution. So that's the idea. That's my idea going forward, which I'm going to welcome your feedback on after I've given you a bit more information on it, as it exists in my head, going forward. So 3 tasks. Number 1, decarbonisation. What do we need to do there? And my argument here is we accelerate in this company arguably the 2 most effective, potent tools in quickly achieving emissions reduction. One is the potential, and of course this is not exclusive. There are many others, not least in energy demand management and efficiency. So the two I've elected for this idea are the potential for solar energy and batteries, because I know a bit about this via Solar Century, to disrupt the fossil fuel incumbency. 22 square meters of that stuff, solar photovoltaics, typically displaces a ton of carbon dioxide, a whole ton, even in a cloudy place like the UK. 22 square meters is not a lot with all the roof space we have on warehouses, for example, like this or stores like this Sainsbury megastore. The second of those interventions is to accelerate timber frame buildings potential for disrupting, the traditional construction industry. This is the single biggest source of carbon dioxide in the world, the construction industry. I forget the exact figure, but it's north of 50% of the emissions come directly and indirectly from buildings and the construction of buildings and the operation of buildings, because they use concrete, steel, and bricks for preference, and not this stuff, which is taking down a ton of carbon dioxide on average, varies by tree species, but on average, a cubic meter of wood typically is taking out of the atmosphere a ton of carbon dioxide. So let's disrupt those fossils in the construction industry the same way that we have begun to disrupt the fossil fuel industry. Task 2 is recarbonisation. So let's accelerate this with a sort of sustainable, positive balance, plenty of room for discussion here, between harvesting forest, obviously, for the building, extensive growing to suck carbon dioxide down out of the atmosphere, and rewilding of mixed woodlands. So we don't do it with industrial monocultures. We do it with beautiful combinations of conifers and broadleaves, and promoting biodiversity, because, climate is not the only problem that we have in the world. And then task 3 is to pressure the people who are dragging their feet. And it's not as though this is a radical suggestion. We have conservative organs like The Economist saying, basically I'm paraphrasing the front cover of that issue of The Economist, this is crazy. These people know what they're doing, they know the science, and despite everything, they're planning to increase fossil fuel production. Yes, they are. Our friendly neighborhood companies, BP and Shell, you see it in their energy scenarios. And the IEA produced an incredibly useful piece of analysis in Davos a few weeks ago, which summed all the capital expenditures of the entire global oil and gas industry. Money deployed, invested right now. How much of it was going into survival and clean energy? 0.7%. Less than 1% of everything they spend, including, a lot of money that's provided by your pensions and the rest of it. Madness. They need to be confronted, and they need people who understand what they're doing and the choices they've made to be out there in the market and pointing out the error of their ways. And Solar Century, as a company, has a history in this. Now, we're not a people power company. We're not owned by large numbers of ordinary people. We're owned by 4 venture capital firms, majority owned. So, if a VC-owned company can do this kind of thing, just imagine what a people power type of company could do. So, here I want to draw on my experience of these 30 years as I see it, a climate campaigner. My investors don't like it when I describe myself as a climate campaigner. They've said to me, some of them in the past, look, you're not. You're a green businessman. Okay, call yourself green, but you're a businessman. No, I'm a climate campaigner. I'm only doing business because I want to make a difference in this existential life and death struggle that we're involved in. So that experience has made me full of hope that all these 3 strands can work. The first is the decarbonisation, and I've watched Solar Century ride this wave. In the orange here, what you see is the global installed capacity of solar photovoltaics. That's exponential growth, and it took off around 2010 as the average cost of solar modules came down. And for those of you who like numbers, this is not a linear scale. This is a log scale. This is how the costs come down and how the global capacity has taken off, doubling 8 times since the turn of the century. Solar century has installed capacity has doubled 11 times in that period. So, you know, I've seen that. I've seen what young engineers and brilliant young people can do when presented with this kind of opportunity in the markets from falling price. So in zero carbon revolution, without getting in the way of Solar Century, which is a wonderful company and will keep doing all this kind of stuff, but there's scope because there's so little solar still in the world, despite its dramatic growth, for other interventions. Particularly, we can talk about this in the discussion if you like, around building integrated. We have a history in Solar Century of integrating solar into buildings, and there's a lot more that can be done there using innovation. But it's not just solar, it's of course timber frame housing, and here's another company, Makar, outside of Inverness, a timber frame construction company, the best in Britain. According to the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, their awards were just recently, last week in fact, and Makar won the New Build Award overall and the Product Innovation Award. So that's part of the team. It's a wonderful little company. This is the kind of buildings that they make. And I remind you again, 1 ton of carbon dioxide going into that wood, locally derived wood. It's not being shipped in from Canada. It's locally derived materials. Wonderful, beyond zero carbon homes being constructed right now, but just not enough of them and not in volume. And this is what the interiors tend to look like, again, made from local material, very, very low carbon here. And this is the kind of thing we have to accelerate. In many respects, what we're trying to do is light up the Green New Deal as I think of it, with beyond zero carbon new build and energy efficiency retrofits using forestry products for energy efficiency panels, not plastic insulation. Lots of local jobs in using local materials, Green New Deal. And in many ways, you know, the experience I had with Solar Century, watching that exponential growth, you know, I'm really hopeful that this kind of thing can be done and disrupt the traditional construction industry. And I should issue a declaration of interest. I've invested in that company. So just as I am obviously a shareholder in Solar Century, I should be very clear about that. I'm and also an investor, minor investor in Makar, because I believe in this stuff so much. Now, recarbonization. This is another area of incredible excitement. The opportunity of this kind of terrain to suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, both in healthy peat bogs, as you see in the foreground there, and forests, as you see in the background. I'm sorry, that's industrial monocultures that were put up in the 1970s. That's not what the future forests have to look like. But wonderful potential, and I've walked around. I bought this area in a plot of land with forests and peatland in Scotland, so it's another direct action. And I've taken visiting ecology experts, including from Rewilding Europe, around it and heard them just enthuse about how you can accelerate the sucking down of carbon into this terrain. And much of it is conifer forest you see here, but there's also the northernmost oak forest in Britain, or you can see it's Loch Ness. It's on the north slopes of Loch Ness and peatland. It's just got wonderful potential for being a holistic carbon sink. And this can be done at much bigger scale, I think. This is just the place that I'm going to live and do experiments in all this carbon stuff and do lots of monitoring and not be constrained too much by commercial considerations. But in zero carbon revolution, we will do this at scale, much bigger plots of land, and we will feed the new industry in building off-site constructed timber frame homes. So if you just work through this diagram, the cycle of how the people power finance, and I'll get to that in a minute, is used, buying of the land and nurturing of the existing trees and soils, the planting and restoration of new woodland and peatland, very selective harvesting of forests. So, the most sustainable balance between, there'll be more trees planted than there will cut down, obviously. So sequestering CO2, then building the homes that lock that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, not burning it in all of it anyway in biomass power plants. And then you pay your investors their returns, and you reinvest the revenues and profits in forestry products, and the rest of it. You do a very vital thing, which I really think and hope that many more businesses can do going forward, which is, you take a percentage of your profits. Solar Century does this. You take a percentage of your profits and you help out in the development equation. So we fund a charity called Solar Aid, and this Zero Carbon Revolution will do the same. And then you repeat. It's a modular process, and before you know it, you're clocking up serious runs for the climate if it works. The third task, pressuring. The world needs companies that can provide young people with hope in their workplace. And here I've seen it in Solar Century. So what this is a Extinction Rebellion protest in London. A team from Solar Century went on this, and this wasn't sort of organized, but what happened was, of course, that a queue built up of young people wanting to have that symbol painted on their faces, which our team were very happy to do. And what that does is it gives a company a sense of purpose. It builds a culture that actually you can defend to hard-nosed business people, because it's a great investment. What it does is protect their biggest asset of all, which is people, and keep them working for the company. So they don't go off and work for competitors. They'd much rather, in general, work for a company that does this kind of thing than, let me not name others. So in Zero Carbon Revolution, we'll copy this model and we go further. It won't be 5%, it'll be 10%. Why not? You're not going to miss 10% of your profits. It's an investment. It's an investment in your staff's well-being, their mental health, and their sense of purpose. They're going to work harder, they're going to achieve more. So as things stand, with our 5%, we fund Solar Aid, and it's a self-help charity, so we have this retail brand. There are no profits, there's no taking of profits, all the profits are recycled, so it's non-profit, if you like. And we help Africans to sell solar lights, and one of those, thinking again in tons of carbon, one of those little lights over its 3-year lifetime, that keeps a ton of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as well. So, how would one go about making this happen? Do you go to Barclays or Goldman Sachs for a loan or an equity investment? No, you don't. It's not worth it. What you do is you turn this into a people power operation initially, and there are 2 stages. First of all, you crowdfund as much as you can to kick the thing off, both in equity and debt. This is where people who want hope, people who care, can kick in. Solar Century team, for example. But it's not just about carbon. You want to make this. There's no point in reinventing companies that just become little mini BPs with a bit of greenery. That's not going to help. So what you want is to create a company where this young lady might want to come and work with her friends. That's your objective. Even if you're an old chap like me, that's what you have to have in mind, because that will make the future work. If people like that, can turn up in a company, in a corporation, and take pride in what they're doing, then you're getting somewhere. And this isn't radical. This is about reforming capitalism as it exists today, which even the Financial Times wants to do. For those of you who missed it, that was the famous front cover on the 16th of September, Capitalism, Time for a reset. Well, you bet it's time for a reset. Capitalism is destroying the living systems on the planet. Even the FT gets that. As the then editor Lionel Barber said, the long-term health of free enterprise capitalism will depend on delivering profit with purpose. So everything you've heard so far from me, which sounds a bit sort of wild maybe, it's not that controversial with this kind of thinking going on. At times it's necessary to reform in order to preserve. I'd of course use stronger words than that, but this is coming from the Financial Times, and they've carried that through. For those of you who read the FT, it's a brilliant paper now. There's all this discussion going on in the, if you like, one of the temples of capitalism. So the third stage is to attract investment at scale from the most progressive pension funds. And this is where we really begin to win, because these pension funds have enormous sums of money. And I particularly have in mind the Nordic pension funds. If we can attract their vast resources, they need scale, they can't invest in easily in little things, we'll really be able to move the dial. And that'll be the aim of the game. And it's also how people who invest in the first stage can exit if they want to. So in 3 years' time, that's my period, the period that's in my head, we make a play to bring in the pension funds, and then probably they will own it, but that's okay, because they themselves are owned by the parents and teachers of Greta Thunberg and her mates, you know? Those kinds of pension funds. So this will be a very, very healthy story, and by that time, we won't just be building little eco-homes of the kind I showed you, it'll be this kind of thing. And this is a modern tower block that is going to be built, according to the current plans, in Toronto, and it will be completely made of wood and glass. So nearly finished with the idea part of the presentation before the Q&A. Some initial ideas, and this is all starters for 10, you know, this is just to kick off a discussion. I don't have firm views on exactly how this will work, but this is what I have currently in the front of my mind. We're in the business of creating hope, a house for hope that, you know, a lot of people can literally and metaphorically invest in. So there's no upper limit set on the crowdfunding. The more we raise, the faster we can make these engines of change and hope work with the kind of people who will be able to attract to come and work for this organization. So initial ideas for the first stage crowdfunding, the target should be 22 million. Why that? Why that? Answer, that piece of land that I showed you in Scotland, I borrowed the money to buy. I didn't borrow it from Barclays or any of these dreadful high street banks. Well, they wouldn't have lent it to me anyway. But I borrowed it from ordinary people. 2.2 million was my target. And I raised that, sorry to sound like a self-important prat, that couldn't possibly be correct, but I raised that in 2 months from ordinary people. So if it's possible to do for a little project like that, you know, surely we can go tenfold bigger for the bigger project. And my idea for those of you finance folk is every investment will comprise 20% equity. So, you know, if you want to exit in 3 years, when in my model the Nordic pension funds come flooding in, then you can, or you can stay invested and your equity value will keep growing. But 80% is debt, and for that you won't get a very high rate of interest. You'll get a higher rate of interest than the wretched banks would give you, but not much higher. That's not the reason for doing it. You're providing low-cost working capital to the company, and your upside comes from the value of your equity. Other ideas, boringly, there should be a minimum investment size because otherwise you get these high transaction costs, as the finance heads say. So maybe that's 2,200, but then groups of friends can, you know, get together. And there should be a maximum investment size because we don't want, you know, rich kids, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs investing vast sums and owning big slugs of the company, maybe even majorities of the company so that they can get fabulously rich and, invent starships and want to go to Mars on them. So maybe we set the total limit at 10%. You can't own nobody can own more than 10%, not even the founders, not me, nobody who's involved at the beginning. And that way you get a genuine people power company. The first exit opportunity I've talked about is the second fundraising, targeting the pension funds, maybe 3 years, it's the target in mind for that. And the other thing we can do is that we can exclude people that we don't want to be involved. So venture capital firms, many of them, they don't care about any of this stuff. They might be attracted to some of the money-making sides of it, but we want people who share the mission. So fossil fuel interests, no, sorry. Even if you're changing, you're not part of this. There's plenty of other climate foot draggers of all kinds, individuals that we don't want to work with. Jeremy Clarkson, no way, you can't invest, Jeremy, sorry. Rupert Murdoch, the list goes on. So that then introduces the really vital question of governance. Who's in charge of this thing? Who runs it? Not individual entrepreneurs. There has to be a team of people doing the governance who represent the interests of all investors, the team, and all the communities involved. So you've got to get a balance right here, I think, to be able to move as fast as this entity would need to move, to take the calculated risks it will need to take, yet to be in the vanguard of capitalism reformed for survival. So to manage that transition from a fast start company to a people power company fit for the 21st century. This is the final slide, initial ideas for the first stage of this, the first stage of the governance. I think you appoint the exec team and the board on a contingent basis going into this fundraising so that people say they're going to be part of this adventure if the money is raised. And then the board has 9 directors. So one person, one vote, and you have the team represented equally with a set of people who will represent the communities, picked from the investors, including obviously one youth representative, and you create a board that has constructive tension built into it so that the principles on which this company has been created can be protected by the totality of that group of people. We should be modern. I mean, you look at the pictures of most companies now, of the boards of most companies, and it's a sea of male faces. So, actively to positively discriminate, it has to be 50-50, and so does the exec team. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that kind of intervention as well. Then you have this transition process from the fast start model, which would be very different from most companies, but have an ability to move fast. And then you transition to this exemplar that Greta and her mates would want to work for. So you have to plan that. I don't know what that company looks like. Clever people at this university probably have done theses on what such a company would look like. But in any event, it should be a consultative process, mapping it out. So maybe what you do in year 1 is there's a really wide consultation. In year 2, you draw up the plan of how you're going to get there. And in year 3, you begin executing it, completing it by the end of year 5. So directors serve for 3 years, and they can be voted out by the totality of the shareholders. That includes the founders, me. I wouldn't want to work for the company if people weren't happy with me being chair of it, which I would be to begin with. They can be re-elected, of course, but they can be replaced by the shareholders voting according to their equity percentage at an AGM. So fun AGMs guaranteed far into the future. And that is the point at which I think I'll stop the presentation. I hope this has been useful. I hope it's teed up a good discussion. I gather we're going to have a break before the discussion, and I look forward to reactions to it, questions about it, and maybe better ideas than the ones you've seen here, because I emphasize again, this is all a start of a 10.
Welcome back to the second half of Cambridge Climate Lecture Series. This is our fourth lecture for the term. Jeremy, wow, lots of lots of questions, and we've got questions here from the audience as well as from the live stream. But you started off by talking about getting solar and batteries sorted out. Where does wind fit in this equation?
Wind's vital, and wind is a great sister for solar, both offshore and onshore, because of the load matching. You know, wind's a totally vital part of the equation, and if I didn't emphasize it enough at that kickoff point, the two interventions I chose were in no way to disparage any others that can be made, because there are no magic bullets here. It's just that solar is doing so well now, and as I'm sure everyone here knows, in most countries in the world, it's the cheapest option right now. When I started 20 years ago, if I had £1 for every energy expert, including many at this university, who'd said to me, you know, you're a rootless dreamer and solar will never be cheaper than nuclear or coal, much less gas, I'd be a very rich man. But we're now the cheapest option going, and it's going to continue for a while unless there's some disruption that we haven't thought of. And then when you marry us and wind up with batteries, you just have a wonderful story of disruption of the incumbents, the fossil fuel incumbency.
So now questions from the floor. Well, let's start. We've got one at the back there, and the microphone is coming over. It's put your hand up, and then that's it.
So you talk quite a lot about sort of 2030 for global decarbonisation. sort of target there. So Bristol, I think, has a net zero target by 2030, and they released their plan and sort of how much that would cost. And I think it's about £12,000 per resident. I couldn't look it up just now. How on earth are we going to get that kind of money together for global decarbonisation, let alone UK decarbonisation by 2030? Bristol isn't a sort of highly emitting sector. It doesn't have a large manufacturing base. That kind of money, how can we get people who are struggling with other kind of, to them, much more pressing issues, like survival, to care about sort of climate change, something that happens far in the future?
Right. Well, far in the future, wait a minute. No. But anyway, let me address the economics question. I think what you always have to look out for, I don't know that study for Bristol. I don't know who did it, and I don't know the viability of the figures. But always what you have to look out for with those studies is what is the cost of business as usual? Because that has a cost too. And I always sort of, there's so many reports, so many pieces of evidence you can summarize. But if I had to draw people's attention to one report, it would be by the Global Commission on Climate and the Economy. It came out about a year ago. It's on my website. And what it does is look at the full panoply, not one city. It looks at the whole global economy and the cost of business as usual versus the cost of zero carbon. You may know this report. You're nodding. So, and it was written by a cast of really serious people backed up by loads of experts. And what they came up with is that by I think you correct me if I'm wrong here, it wasn't 2030, I think it might have been 2035. Anyway, some way on the route to 2050, it was before 2050. What they came up with was the conclusion that, whatever we do, whether we do it dirty, whether we do it clean, we're going to have to invest $90 trillion. So this is my point about, business as usual. It's not cost-free. To be fair, the clean option wasn't cheaper. It was about the same in this report. The difference was what you saved by going clean as opposed to dirty. And the figure there is $24 trillion. 24 trillion. So, that's a good place to start with these kinds of economics equations. There'll be any number of reports produced by right-wing think tanks mostly who, will tell you it's impossibly costly to save the world. But actually the reverse is the truth, both on a global scale and on a local scale. And solar is an exemplar of that. We're not a magic bullet, but look at our history. What do you want to build now out in the fens here if you need extra energy? Well, your first and best option is to do energy efficiency. That's better than anything else. But if you want new energy generation, what do? Do you build a nuclear power plant? Only if you want to waste literally tens of billions of pounds. Or do you go for coal or gas? No, you can do solar cheaper at utility scale. And that's the future.
But new houses are being built with gas boilers.
Crazy.
How do we change? What do we have to change in terms of
those houses I showed you pictures of? Mm-hmm. You barely need heating in them, even in some of the snowy weather in Scotland. The heat from your computer, from your buildings, they're passive house standard. And it's because they're so well built and the panels of timber so locked together and so well insulated with breathable material, not these ghastly plastic things that the volume house builders use if they do any energy efficiency.
So do we have to change planning regulations, or what do we have to change?
Well, that would help. That would help. I mean, and I think increasingly progressive governments, local governments, the Scottish government, with their devolved powers, increasingly they'll say, you're not going to build this stuff anymore. And you won't build anything unless it's got, some kind of auto generation capacity. And so even with conservative governments, I think we'll see this kind of intervention, because the sense of crisis is so acute now that they'll have to do it, whatever their belief systems might have done historically with the support for shale gas, say, or nuclear, or all the things they preferred, the long list of things they preferred from the incumbency ahead of the survival technologies.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I have two closely related questions. So first of all, you mentioned the buildings of the future, but most of the buildings in 2050 are already built. They're poorly insulated, they're powered by gas boilers, and we have 30 million gas boilers in the UK. And secondly, we have transport. We'll see a move towards electric cars, but that requires enormous infrastructure expertise and the ability to construct infrastructure at enormous scale. So I have two questions based on those points. Firstly, how do we deal with those 30 million gas boilers in homes that rely on high-grade heat, so not heat pumps at the moment for those old homes? And secondly, is it realistic to do such a large change of infrastructure that's needed in the transport sector and perhaps also in the heating sector without involving the companies that have the ability to do that scale and the expertise to do that scaling, which is inevitably BP and Shell?
Yeah, and but don't misunderstand me. I think these companies will come to the party, but not before they're pressured more than they are being pressured at the moment. If they're left to their own devices, they will do it at their own pace. And if you look through the sophistry of their rhetoric and, you know, the great skill with which they communicate, the greenwash that they push out, that has to be deconstructed, and they really have to be forced to change. And then, of course, they can bring to bear their significant balance sheets in a very big way. You remember that figure that I gave you from the IEA, 0.7% of CapEx, and it's been flat since Paris. So there's a fantastic chart. I didn't want to put too many charts up, but you can see the IEA since Paris, how much additional CapEx has that industry spent on things like you describe, energy efficiency interventions, demand-side management, batteries, all the rest of it. Flat at 0.7%. To be fair to BP and Shell, it's a bit higher, but not that much higher. And if you look at their energy scenario models for the future, both BP and Shell, in 2040, when we have to be at zero, they have us, both of them, have us burning more oil and gas then than we are today. That's the full extent of our challenge with the incumbency.
So the transport infrastructure, I mean, we've got...
Has to be electrified. I'm not anti-hydrogen. I think hydrogen might have a big place to play as well. But there has to be massive electrification and getting people into electric vehicles, and of course out of vehicles altogether into public transport.
But we noticed today that we are, even within the UK, pretty dependent on aviation for short journeys.
Yeah.
We lose the company that does those small flights. What are the alternatives? The alternatives are not in place.
Well, you know, alternatives are in place. I mean, I go up and down to Scotland on the sleeper train. It's hideously expensive, and you know, it doesn't go very fast. But there are alternatives, and I think, you know, if we get this sort of the headwinds for innovation. I think there are 40 companies now in the world that are working on short-haul electric flight. And some of them are not far off, I read, market-ready aircraft. But, you know, at the end of the, you look at the zero-carbon Britain scenario, they do leave a bit of scope for aviation. You have to do that. This is the last problem that's going to get solved. It's a thorny one. I think the one the gentleman mentioned there, the energy efficiency of the old housing stock is really tricky, and that will need big energy efficiency interventions that will go beyond low-hanging fruit. There will be costs in the stranded assets of all those gas boilers. But if we are serious about heading off climate change, we will do it and we will strand those assets, and we'll find a way of getting around that. And so I think we've identified what I would describe as the two biggest problems: long-haul aviation and energy efficiency in the old housing stock.
Okay.
Right. Thank you very much. I have a question about the power of legislation versus the power of the market. Because like you just said, for many of the problems we actually have the solutions. We have electric vehicles, we have heat pumps, we know how to retrofit homes. We've known this for homes retrofitting for decades, for heat pumps and electric vehicles that are on the market for quite a while now. Yet the uptake rate is incredibly low if you compare it to the number of conventional cars and gas boilers and so forth. So, and I feel that we have a complete lack of legislation in this field and the lack of good incentives. So the market itself did not provide a good solution here. So where do you see the balance between legislation and the market? Thank you.
Yeah, well, it becomes a wish list. I did think coming out of Paris there would be more intervention in support of technologies and strategies that could get us down to 2 degrees and 1.5, if possible. But look what happened in Britain. Amber Rudd, who was then the Environment Secretary, came back from that summit and a few days later gave a speech as to how David Cameron's "let's get rid of the green crap," you remember that? Let's get rid of the green crap, and she had to do that, and a whole raft of changes were made in support for renewables in the UK, which were devastating and absolutely counter to the spirit and the letter of the agreement that she had just helped negotiate in Paris. So I agree with you, there should be more legislation, there should be more regulation, but in the current politics, the populist drift to the right politics that we're living in at the moment, it's difficult to imagine it. And that's why you need, I think, you need the pressure, you need the painful pressure to be put on the people who will drag their feet if given the choice, based on their intrinsic belief systems, but won't if they're under what they would count as meaningful political pressure. And you see it in the case, I would argue, you see it, the first cracks appearing in the Scandinavian countries, where they have conservative politicians, but they daren't go against these trends that are there in their populations. They do stuff that our politicians currently wouldn't dream of. And that, I think, there is hope that will spread, proliferate, but it will take things like this idea that I've had for a campaigning company to contribute towards making that happen, so that then the legislation and regulation can come back, can have a bit of a resurrection and once again get consistent with Paris. Now, all that said, I think we should distinguish between national governments and local governments. There's an awful lot that local governments can do, and that's very exciting, and regional governments as well. So I've got great hopes for Scotland. This place I bought is in Scotland, obviously, and as people here may know, Scotland generated all of its electricity in the first quarter of this year from renewable energy, all of it. And okay, that's supply, and there's issues with demand and transport and everything else. But regional governments are very important, local governments. Perth, the city of Perth in Scotland, currently has a plan to be the first city in Europe to get to zero carbon, and to be the exemplar city of medium-sized cities in Europe. And there are many other cities that are doing good, city governments that are doing good things.
Over here.
Hi there, I really enjoyed your talk, so thank you. So you mentioned rightly that the price of solar energy is going way down and becoming a lot cheaper, and of course if it was a level playing field we would see it, really taking off even more and more. But alongside the rise of solar in the last 10 years, we've also seen an increase in fossil fuels, and we've had an increase in expansion and in extraction and production. And of course, the reason why that is because it isn't a level playing field. We see, heaps of fossil fuel subsidies, and you mentioned that the oil and gas companies are still planning this expansion of production, but it's not just the companies, it's the countries, right? And you mentioned the NDCs and how there's this gap in between the 1.5 and the 3 and the 3.3. And even those same countries that have like a relatively good NDC, they are also concurrently planning to expand their fossil fuel extraction. And you've probably read, and a lot of the audience has probably read the production gap report, which came out late last year on this. So it's leading up. This is leading to a question, I promise. It's not just a comment. I'm not quite that old yet. No offense to anyone. So when you talk about the pressure, it seems like a key part of this pressure has to be on the policy side, and it has to be specifically on what keeps the fossil fuel industry and it has to be targeted on this supply side, on winding down the production and kind of infrastructure around the fossil fuels. So I was wondering, and this is my question, what does pressure mean? Is it meaning you and your staff and your company, you get out there in the streets? Is it meaning you hire a top lobbyist and get in there with the government officials in the rooms? What really does that mean specifically in this context of we need to wind down the fossil fuel industry as well as increase solar?
Well, let me give you two examples. I mean, it's a good question, and it's subject matter for the neuroscientists. I mean, I think all of us need to be talking to the neuroscientists more, because of everything they've discovered over the last 10 years about how our brains work individually and collectively. But my two examples, I think, I hope, will answer your question. We'll give you two big ticket answers to the question. One is just the way this plays out at the family level. I know a lady from a company that should be nameless. It's not BP, it's not Shell, it's another very big oil company. She is very senior, and we have had frank discussions about, because I used to be one of these people. When I was at Imperial College on the faculty, I was an oil and gas person, really. I took most of my research was funded by oil companies, by BP and Shell. I was a graduate student with a lot of the people who are now senior in the industry, or recently been. So I can talk to them. I don't froth at the mouth. I have a point of view, of course, but I don't call them hateful monsters and all that. And so I was talking to this lady, and she told me what it was like around her breakfast table. She said, "Can you imagine the pressure I'm under from my young kids?" And I said, "No, I can't. I probably can," but I let her elaborate. And this is not, you wouldn't want to be that mother, That's serious pressure. And it's coming from Scandinavian school teachers, it's coming from the zeitgeist, it's coming from all the things that are going on and growing fast in our society over the last 2 years, just as the deterioration's happened. So we need more and more of that. We want these people to feel profoundly uncomfortable in their own skins. That's what will make it change, before their children actually take over from them, in these executive positions. Now, the other thing, and this is why I don't get invited so much into oil and gas companies anymore to give internal talks. I used to at one time. But what if I'm given a chance to sit down with one of these oil and gas leaders, what I say to them is, you want to be very, very careful. That would be my advice, because you're living in a world where, this is now, in the opinion polls, defined as the #1 issue in multiple countries. And we live in a world where society is capable of looking back in anger, retrospective, legal liability cases. Now, you may know there are more than 1,000 court cases going on around the world where individuals and groups and organizations and cities, forgive me if you know all this, I bet you do, but others might not. There are more than 1,000 court cases underway. And okay, nobody has yet gone to jail, but don't bet that they won't. And at best, their pensions will be under threat. And at worst, the particularly egregious miscreants, the people who've buried internal reports, who've funded disinformation campaigns, and there are loads of those, including in the companies we're supposed to respect and admire. Ultimately, some of those leaders may be picked on by society and jailed in their dotage. I think that is a risk. You just present it as a risk, and they hate it when you talk like that. But I think that's the truth. And okay, it may be a certain amount of wishful thinking on my part coming in, but that's what I mean by pressure across society. Those two examples. There are many others, but.
Hey, Jeremy, thanks for your talk. You talked about the importance of moving finance away from fossil fuels. I'm not sure if you're aware, but the university currently has over 300 million invested in fossil fuels, a terrifying amount of money. And when put to the flame, they claim that they can have more sway at shareholder meetings and potentially move BP and Shell away from fossil fuels.
Ha ha.
Yeah, I'd just like to hear your opinion as a businessman as an energy businessman, of the two approaches of that approach versus straight out divestment.
Well, number one, let's, looking at some of the sums of money we've been talking about in the discussion so far. 300 million sounds like a lot. It is a lot to the likes of you and me. It's not a lot to the oil and gas industry. So they're not worried what, some university trustee, that they're much more interested in, how many chairs get endowed over there in Downing Street and which faculty members get funded and where they get their top talent from. And Oxbridge is high on the charts. I know this. I mean, I've seen it. So the university is playing a dreadfully disingenuous game. It's the same at Oxford, of course. You're not alone here. It's utterly ridiculous to be teaching young people everything that all the faculty members can and do teach them about climate change with one hand, and in the other hand, literally fueling the destruction of the planet. It is completely indefensible. Now, that said, if there's I do understand the point of view of some of the really big investors, the pension funds, who are going to find it really, really difficult to divest all at once out of fossil fuels. So I don't have a completely black and white view of divestment versus engagement. I think people have to remain engaged, but they have to have the firepower and the throw weight to engage. And they have to do things like Legal & General did a few months ago. They just divested from ExxonMobil. They had engaged with ExxonMobil for years, and their head of engagement said, at a certain point, you just have to say, they're not responding to what we're saying, so we're divesting. Now, I don't know how that played out in ExxonMobil, but they couldn't take too many of those interventions, which is a sort of combination of engagement and divestment. But a university, a small amount of money like £300 million, no. Take a stand for the future, and divest. Now, Oxford, I was part of the student and alumni campaign. So I have a doctorate from Oxford University. So I was part of the protests that said, if you don't divest from oil and gas, we're going to give our degrees back. Remember that last year? So unfortunately, I had to give back my doctorate, which my mother was not pleased with me. But fortunately, I do have an honorary doctorate from Heriot-Watt University, which is, of course, an even bigger investor in oil and gas. But, you know, no one says you have to be consistent in this world, right?
Well, Jeremy, this college, Trinity College, is a big investor in various things. And there are some students in this room who were invited to go to shareholder meetings. I think went to Shell, BP and BAE Systems, and were treated pretty badly, patronised and basically told, well, don't worry, we know what we're doing, you just get on with your studies and everything will be just fine. And I think the idea that you can engage is just really not borne out by experience. So I think that's a very good question. Right, we have another question here.
Yeah, Jeremy, I love the thing you said about the zero carbon revolution and £22 million crowd fund. Can you explain a little bit more about what I'd be investing in exactly? Is it a startup fund? Is it asset classes? You know, tell me a bit more granularity of what that actually is.
Well, the idea at the moment, and this is just the starter idea. I don't know what the best formulation is, but the idea at the moment is you'd be investing for every £100 you put in, 20 of that would go as equity. You would have shares in the company, and the rest would go as debt with a, you know, almost token interest rate. So you'd be taking an equity bet along with everyone else, and it would be the same, no differences in shareholder, in share classes or anything like that. Everyone would be an equal pro rata ordinary shareholder. And if it all works out and the revenues soar and we hit those updrafts that I've showed you for solar, and we do that in solar, we replicate that in housing, and then we get lucky with the forestry and the peat box. There's a bit, I didn't emphasize this, but obviously you can imagine there's a bit of a bet here. The bet is that governments are going to bring in a carbon pricing regime that will reward people and companies and organizations who look after peatlands and nurture them, and who look after forests and harvest them sustainably and replant more than they harvest, etc., etc. So that you've got two definite revenue streams, and then a third that would be, you know, a bit of a punt, but we're not going to beat the climate change problem unless governments come in with a carbon pricing regime pretty damn quick. And you'd be benefiting from that as well. So that if you wanted, in an ideal situation, in 3 years' time, we'd be at a scale that would just about be attractive enough to pension funds for them to come piling in, and then you could exit. Then you could sell your shares, and you'd have made, hopefully, I hope, a ton of money. Which then you can reinvest in other green things, of course. Yeah, very well.
Is that microphone switched on? I didn't.
Try that.
Yeah.
Ah, yes, that works. Okay, I'd like to run another few enterprises, possible enterprises past you. One is offshore solar. Now seems to be cheaper than onshore solar, but going thermal because it's not materially constrained like photovoltaics are. What's the scope for that? Using the nitrogen supply for the food industry as storage in the system, that's 3% of global emissions. So that could use the spare power for renewables when they're exceeding the current demand. We could have a carbon neutral airline within a year using carbon capture and storage. It's currently double the price of regular aviation fuel, but that would come down rapidly at scale. And I think that some people would be prepared to pay more for their flights if they were carbon neutral. So I don't think that flying is evil. It's the carbon emissions that are the problem. And there's no reason why we shouldn't continue to fly if we don't do carbon emissions. and my own personal enterprise, which is investing in nature conservation reserves. Just a few other options.
All great ideas, and I suppose one element of the dream I'm having here, whether or not I can breathe life into it or not, I don't know. But one element of that dream is to be a front runner in something different. I think if we could get some really serious people power interventions going, then ideas like some of those you just articulated, can come in the wake and similarly follow on, because it's very small scale. It's only 2.2 million, but it sort of struck me as this story unfolded with raising the debt for buying the plot of land with the forests and the peat in Scotland. If more people did this, and most of the people who invested weren't, I know them and they know me well enough to say, look, if it all goes to pot, we're going to be able to rely on this guy to sell the land again and repay us. That's ultimately the trust piece. But, if more people in their networks can do that sort of thing, we can really teach the banks a lesson, take a lot of power away from them. And I think that's another part of the piece of reforming capitalism. They're so out of order now, these banks, and they've done so little to reform themselves since the financial crisis, or be reformed by regulators.
So part of that question was about offshore solar. So what?
Yes, no, I noticed, absolutely, we haven't done any, but I noticed how the floating arrays survived those storms really well.
And what's the key to that?
I don't know. I'm not an engineer, despite my honorary degree in engineering from Heriot-Watt University, which everyone in all the engineers in the company find hilarious every time it's raised.
There we go, up here. Is that microphone switched on?
Thank you. Christopher, I'm a founder at a Cambridge-based clean tech company that works in smart grids, specifically large ones with councils in the south of England. And also for my sins, I previously worked at a large energy company. So I've seen the frustrations of trying to deploy low-carbon technologies both in the private sector and in local communities. And two big themes that were blockers, both in the private sector and the community, is lack of knowledge of how to install and develop these systems at a cost-effective scale. And the second problem was marginal business models, which is mostly linked to a lack of cost-reflective pricing of carbon. In the context of the company that you propose, how could we tackle these challenges of lack of expertise in low-carbon technologies, and increasing, or rather pushing, the governments and the local authorities to implement some form of a cost-reflective carbon tax, which reinforces low-carbon business models?
Yeah, so the two parts of that piece would be refocusing of training and education. So I must say, we haven't noticed in solar a lack of a talent pool. Solar is wonderful, but it's not rocket science, and that hasn't been an issue for us. I have heard in the contacts I've made in off-site constructed timber frame housing, there is an issue with getting skilled people, trained people in some of the roles that are needed there. So, but that's easily dealable with, and you bring in that Scottish company, for example. We are talking to the Highlands and Islands Enterprise, which is their equivalent of the Department of Industry here in Westminster. And so I think you could tackle that quite quickly through interventions by government and then the second question you asked was about getting the carbon pricing into the equation to attach a rocket motor to these clean energy companies. And there, I think we need to take a lesson from the oil and gas industry. They are so effective at lobbying. And I know the renewables industries are way behind in terms of the sophistication and throw weight of the lobbying. But that can be changed as well as time goes by. A few really good, sophisticated lobbyists can get a long way, I think. And I believe that as this, the company would have an external affairs department. And maybe we hire one or two of these really skillful lobbyists from the oil and gas companies. Of course, they would have to have a conscience. They'd have to be, reformed. Exactly. But they're very good at what they do. One of their lobbyists said to me once, "I will say," no, I won't. That will get me into trouble. One of the big companies, I was talking to him one day complaining about this and that in British energy policy. And he said, "Who do you think writes the energy policy, Jeremy?" And I said, "Well, I guess you do, don't you?" And he said, "Yes, we do." And that's the truth. They have so many embedded staff on their payroll in the ministries that they basically get what they want up to now.
So we got a question down here.
Please.
Yeah.
Okay. Hugh asked my question about building regs, which is annoying. So as we have you here and you know about the energy industry, I presume you're familiar with Chris Goodall and his new book about what we should do now.
Yes.
And his basic proposal that rather than the current CCC plan, a better plan would be a 20 times, factor of 20 increase in wind and solar and an awful lot of hydrolysis to deal with all the difficult things, gas heating and aviation. Do you think that's a good plan? That's actually practical? Or should we stick with what the CCC said?
I don't think I have a considered opinion on that one. I haven't read Chris's latest, and I'm desperately trying to resist the temptation to tell some stories about what Chris thought about solar when we started out 20 years ago. So let me move swiftly on. Now he thinks it's a very good idea, of course, and it is, but it's not a magic bullet. I emphasise again, and I just don't know the details of his plan, so I'm not going to comment on that. But what I am going to do, which I think may be useful for people who, follow that level of detail in the debate, the one place to go to for a really inspirational, quantitative study of what you can do with solar and how quickly you can do it with marriage partners in the other renewables industries is the world's first study in real time of renewable energy systems, dividing the world up into 140 regions. And, yes, you know it. But others might not. So it's the technical university, the Finnish technical university at Lappeenranta. It's an international team run by a brilliant German called Christian Breyer. And if you just Google it, you will see this. An executive report, the executive summary is very good, but it's worth diving into the detail. And that will really inspire you with what can be done because it's rooted in a year's worth of real weather data. And it has wind and solar as the backbone of a 100% renewables future. And that's I think the number one piece of evidence that we have from the modelling community. So the things to Google would be Christian Breyer, or if you can look up Lappeenranta, which is the rather unfortunate name for the Finnish university. And it's a massive study funded by the German Environment Ministry, and it came out at some point last year. And if you go on my website, I've done a pictures and charts summary for the busy folk, where you will see all the conclusions rendered into pictures and charts, and easier to understand than reading the whole report if you're busy.
So we're coming up to the end now. We've got one question from the internet. How do you respond to people who claim that activists are hypocritical because they fly and they drive cars and?
Yeah, well, we're all none of us are perfect, and I'm not pretending. I mean, I go up and down to Scotland on the sleeper where I can. I took the boat to Copenhagen to the climate summit, and I took the train to Poland for the climate summit. But can't do that every time. I mean, yes, all right, we're a bit hypocritical, but it's important that we don't let that get in the way of doing the best we can.
Well, I think that's a very important message, and I think thank you very much for coming to speak to us tonight, and please join me in thanking Jeremy. Thank you.